Patrick Byrne. I'm here to talk about fear and failure. Hopefully you guys already know that. You didn't just stumble into some random room and start listening to somebody talk. I assume you would have left by now if that were the case. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Before I begin, though, I would like to tell a brief story to set the stage. Last summer, I attended the Madison Ruby Conference, which is an excellent conference, even for non-Rubyists. I suggest everybody in this room attend it later this year. But I was at a talk titled, What Stuttering Taught Me About Marketing, from a woman named Sharon Steed. The speaker had a severe stutter and talked, among other things, about the effect that it had on her career, that she originally let it hold her back. But then she learned she didn't have to, that she could use it. She could use her vulnerability to her advantage. No slides, just her talking through the stutter. And I was inspired by this. I was motivated by this, but mostly I was ashamed. I was ashamed of the projects I didn't start, the people that I didn't introduce myself to, the pitches I didn't make, the solutions I didn't propose, the pull requests I didn't submit, all because I was afraid. But this woman with a stutter was commanding the attention of a room of a few hundred with only the power of her voice. And that led to some soul-searching, some self-assessment, and this talk, in which I explore the interrelated topics of fear and failure. As for my credentials, I have a lot of experience with both. So let's get started. What am I afraid of? I'm afraid of a lot of things. I'm afraid of spiders. I'm afraid of looking foolish, of embarrassing myself. I'm afraid that people will not think as highly of me as they think they should. I'm afraid that maybe they're right to not think very highly of me. I'm not as smart as I think I am. I'm afraid of losing everything I've ever loved, but that's not what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about are two very specific fears and spend a little bit of time on them. I'm afraid that I cannot possibly be smart enough or skilled enough to do the work that I'm doing at the pay that I'm receiving with the talented people that I'm doing it with, that eventually they will realize that I do not belong. Does this sound familiar to anyone in the room? That fear has a name, imposter syndrome. It's common enough, especially at the beginning of a career, but even when transitioning within your career, that I think it warrants some special attention. To grossly oversimplify a pretty complex problem, imposter syndrome, for those that don't know, is when you don't believe that you deserve the success that you've achieved. That despite all of the evidence, you believe that you're a fraud or lucky, or you've tricked people into believing that you are smarter or more competent than you truly are. Studies have shown anywhere between 40 to 70% of successful, high-achieving people have experienced imposter syndrome at some point in their career. I want to let that sink in. Half the people in this room either have or will experience imposter syndrome at some point. Why could that be? Because we can't all be frauds, can we? Well, it's often very hard to internalize our own successes. It was easy is something you'll often hear and often say. But if some task or insight came easy to me because of the study and the practice that I put in, I can trick myself into believing that it wasn't hard to begin with, or it wasn't important. Another thing people say is that anybody could have figured this out, which belies the fact that somebody else didn't. I did, or you did. You do every day. Some of us are modest by default. We were raised that way. It's impolite to boast. But it's important to distinguish braggadocio from honest self-assessment. And on top of that, human beings in general, and often it feels the technology community specifically, are very good at identifying heroes and idolizing them. Their successes and their ideas become enshrined as gospel. We raise them above us, believing that simpletons such as ourselves really can't hope to achieve the success that they have, which ignores their humanity and lacks respect for the struggles that they experience, which are equal to mine and to yours. This is a tweet that I like to remind myself about from Gary Bernhardt, host of the Destroy All Software screencasts, which everybody should check out if you haven't already. He speaks at conferences around the world. Reminder, your idols poop daily, sometimes with urgency. Discard your idols. I like to keep that around to remind myself that my heroes, that the people that I revere, are just people. And that when I tell myself, I can never be as smart or as successful as such and such person, that's bullshit. fancy word. I'm sure some of you have come across this before. To, again, grossly oversimplify, the Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which the unskilled overestimate their ability, while the highly skilled underestimate their ability, which seems pretty counterintuitive on the surface, but it makes a certain sense in a couple of different ways. Once you reach a certain level of knowledge and skill, you begin to become aware of just how little you know on a given topic. In the beginning, you didn't realize how much effort it would take to master something, but now you really begin to do understand. And so even though you know so much more than you did before, if you place it in the greater context of the entire body of available knowledge that you've come to discover, it can feel like you're taking a step backward. I'm sure we've all heard the adage, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. And on top of that, as you begin to develop and grow, you begin to understand the nuances of the problems that you're attempting to solve. Where once you felt so sure of yourself, you now begin to regularly question all of your assumptions. And while that can feel like a negative, it's in fact evidence that you're growing in skill and competence. But there's another aspect I want to address. I'm going to briefly quote from the paper. The miscalibration of the incompetent stems from an error about the self, whereas the miscalibration of the highly competent stems from an error about others. So the unskilled often believe that they know more than they really do, but the highly skilled believe that everyone else must know so much more than they really do. So even though I might have a firm grasp on what it is that I know, I can get it into my head that everyone else must know so much more. Because I don't see everybody's day-to-day problem solving, I don't see their struggles. I just compare my own experience to the awesome things that everybody else accomplishes. So if you combine the Dunning-Kruger effect with raising your heroes as being above all this, you end up in a situation where you don't believe that you've deserve the success that you've achieved compared to your heroes and your peers. All right, that's all well and good, but what can we do to combat imposter syndrome? Well, the good news is that the simplest way to combat it is to simply understand that it exists, that many of your colleagues feel it too, and that you might be smarter and better than you give yourself credit for. One way I do that is that when I do something awesome, like speak in front of a room full of people, I like to write it down. It gives me a running list of the cool shit I've done that I can review from time to time if I need a little bit of a pick-me-up. Because I often do, because I continue to struggle with imposter syndrome a decade into a successful career. And that's okay, I suppose, because I know many of you feel it too, and there's a certain comfort in that. But that's not the only fear that I feel on a regular basis. This one's super powerful. This is the one that can stop me from even trying or stick to the small potatoes, the stuff I know I can achieve, to ignore the big problems and the hard challenges. And I'm hopeful I'm not alone in this regard either. My brain, like many others' brains, is remarkably good at telling me dumb things. It tells me that if I do nothing new, that if I keep doing what I'm doing now, then I can't lose what I have. That's my reptile brain speaking, which is flawed logic, because if I keep my current skills by focusing on this little fiefdom that I've managed to accumulate for myself, and everyone else continues to progress, I'm going to fall behind. And anyway, if I lose whatever cool thing, whatever cool shiny thing that I like right now because I tried something else, it's not like I had a very firm grasp on it to begin with anyway. My brain also tells me that if I keep doing the things that I know how to do, people won't see me struggle, they won't see me fail, and they will never have a reason to think any less of me. And that's also flawed, because if a friend or a coworker struggles and fails at something hard, do I think any less of them? Of course not. I want to support them, and I want to help them because I want them to succeed, and the same is true of them to me or to you. Failing all that, my brain will tell me that struggle is hard. And so I'd really rather just skip that. I'm sure I'm not alone in this room, growing up as one of the bright kids. Other euphemism is it tested well. I didn't have to try very hard to pass my class. I didn't do a lot of homework, and when I did, it wasn't that difficult. And I apologize if this sounds like I'm bragging, because I'm not. Because ultimately, I didn't develop the skills necessary to tackle difficult challenges until well into adulthood. And so when faced with something hard, I wall up, I freeze, I fall back on those bad old habits. what are we going to do about the fear of failure? Much like imposter syndrome, it helps to understand that it's not just me. I can diminish its crippling effects with the realization that it is normal and that it is common, because everyone feels the fear. Your friends, your loved ones, your coworkers, your boss, your heroes, they all feel it. This is another tweet from late last year from my boss, Dan Cederholm, author of 5 books, CSS expert, world-traveling speaker, co-founder of Dribbble, the world's most awesome social network, and as pictured here, accomplished banjo player. People that don't constantly ask themselves, am I doing it wrong? I envy you, he tweeted. Despite all his successes, he has doubts. So why should I be surprised that I do too? So when I think to myself that I will apply for that awesome job when I'm ready, or I will start this new project once I've learned that one more crucial skill, or I'll pitch my boss on this idea after I've had a little bit of time to practice a little bit more, or I will introduce myself to that cool person at the conference the next time I run into them when I'm feeling a little bit more confident, I need to stop letting the doubt win, because the doubt will never go away. So another way to battle that fear is to embrace it, to push ourselves, to believe in ourselves, as kitschy as that might sound, to desensitize ourselves to the fear's effects by repeated exposure, which I suppose is its own reward. Because we will frequently succeed, but we need to understand that we will often fail, which handily leads us to our next topic. Please allow me to repeat myself. I will fail. I will fail at something, sometime. It is probably many things. It is like one of life's fun little guarantees. So I suppose for the same reasons that I suggested you embrace your fear, you should embrace your failure. It's going to happen whether you want it to or not. So by running headlong into the failure, you learn resilience. This is from a blog post last year by Jason Friedman of 42 Floors. Resilience is a learned trait, perhaps one of the most important character traits one can possibly have. He wrote that when people are intimidated by the work in front of them, some respond with an innate resilience. But for others, that's not their natural reaction. My reaction, as I earlier mentioned, is to back down or to give up. But by forcing myself to persevere, I get a little better every time. I don't always succeed, but in trying, it gets a little easier. As the Mythbusters say, failure is always an option. While failure isn't a goal, it can be quite valuable because you can learn so much from your failure if you're paying attention. After outages or other major problems at work, we perform a frequently brief postmortem in which we ask ourselves 5 questions. First, what happened? It's really more documentation, what broke, so we can refer to it again in the future. What was the solution? Another kind of more basic problem, so that way if it ever happens again, we know how to fix it. Then we move on to some of the softer questions. What went well? Because we want to honor the things that we're doing correctly. Did we communicate well? Were we alerted immediately of the problem? Did we arrive at a solution quickly and implement it? Then we ask ourselves, what didn't go well? Because we need to recognize that we're not perfect. Were we stepping on each other's toes when we were out on the server investigating the problem? Did we have insufficient monitoring in place? Did a vendor let us down? But the most important question is what is the follow-up? What are we going to do going forward to either mitigate this problem or prevent it in the future? Do we need better documentation? Do we need better monitoring? Do we need better tools? And this was pretty heavily influenced by reading what they call just culture at Etsy, just as in justice, the foundation of which are blameless postmortems. Rather than identifying some root cause, the person or people who screwed up, and punishing them, attempt to identify the parts of the system that were insufficient. Lack of training, lack of monitoring, lack of tests. And if you focus on fixing those, you end up with a better system independent of any particular person. This stems from the assumption that failures in complex systems are systemic, rather than having a single identifiable root cause. It was the confluence of some number of things that either broke all at once or had been broken and you never noticed, that brought down your site or caused some poor performance. And by pointing to one person and blaming them for a shitty deploy solves none of that. But improving your tooling and your process and your communication as an organization will. And by removing the concept of blame, of scapegoating, of finger pointing, everyone is free to be honest without fear of reprisal. And if we're going to fail anyway, might as well practice the art of failing well, make it easier on ourselves. One way I like to do that is to try a small thing to fail with. Because if I succeed, hooray, I can build on that thing. I can try something a little bigger, a little riskier. But if I fail, hooray, I failed at something small, so who gives a shit? Try a new thing. This is neither a tweet nor a blog post. This is a quote from 19th century French author Gustave Flaubert. If I pronounce that incorrectly, please do not correct me. It's been rattling around my brain for a little over a decade since I originally came upon it. Be regular and orderly in your life, that you may be violent and original in your work. I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I'm not going to spend the rest of my time talking about that. The one part I want to focus on is that I think one part of failing well is failing in as few places at a time as possible. It's easier to fail well from a stable foundation. It's easier to try a new job if your life at home is already going smoothly. It's easier to take the risk of starting your own business if you've got a little bit of money set aside. So it helps to pick the thing that you want to take your risks on and then get everything else as situated as possible. Has anyone seen this phrase before? It goes around different programming communities at different times, but it originated in the 80s in the Lisp community, suggesting that there's a hierarchy of goals when you're building your software, and that simplicity is the most important thing to focus on, followed then by correctness, and then consistency, and then way in last place is completeness. And it's easy to miss the point because of the memorable phrasing. We're not talking about worse quality. We're talking about doing fewer things so that way you can do them better. Simplicity and correctness are more important than completeness. And to a software developer like myself, that can come as quite of a shock. Many of us value completeness or correctness as being paramount, dooming us to a big, bad kind of failure. Whereas if you start with simplicity, we fail in small, manageable increments until we reach correctness, moving from top to bottom, perhaps never even reaching completeness unless it's strictly necessary. And that's a good kind of failure. Has anyone in this room heard of a game called The Game Never Ending from a company called Ludicorp? It's a browser-based MMO in around 2004. I'm seeing no hands, and you'd be forgiven for never having heard of it before because it's a product that never launched. They couldn't quite get the game right, couldn't quite get it to work to their satisfaction, and so what they ended up doing is taking one small feature of the game, sharing pictures with your friends, took the ideas and the technology behind that, and launched Flickr, one of the most influential social networks of its time, if not today. Another example is Odeo from a company called Obvious. Anyone heard of that? It's a podcasting service. There's one hand up there from about 2005. They couldn't, that did launch, but they couldn't quite get the product to work as a business. They couldn't quite figure out how to make money being a podcasting service. And so what they ended up doing is falling back on their second idea and launched Twitter, which I'm sure many of you in this room have heard of. The point that I'm trying to make is that if our idea isn't working, it's not because we're bad thinkers or bad developers or bad people. Frequently, we have other ideas that we're ignoring while we focus on this failure. And maybe one of your second ideas is your success. The fears that I've been talking about tonight are fears that are very real, and I feel them regularly, less than I used to, and hopefully you will feel them less too. And if you take away nothing else from me talking to you today, I want you to give yourselves permission to fail well. It's by this struggle and this failure that we continue to grow, be it as developers, friends, or human beings. And if Sharon Steed can stand on stage stuttering in front of a room of hundreds and tell us about how she's conquered the problems that life's placed in front of her, what do you think that each of us in this room can accomplish? Thank you for your time and attention. Those of you with watches will see that we have not used up the time that is allotted for us today. And that's because I think some of the most fruitful parts of this presentation that I've given in the past has been the conversation and the Q&A afterwards, as people maybe talk about their failures or ask any questions they have about maybe conquering any fears that they have. And so I invite you all to speak up, and let's make this more of a conversation, less me speaking at you and more all of us talking together and maybe hopefully growing. Yes, in the back.
Did you have like an epiphany one day where you're like, wow, failure can be good, I can learn something from this, or is it kind of like saw other people doing it and you kind of took up the idea?
Yeah, actually, I like I said, I've had a lot of experience with failure in my career, and most of my experience with failure early on in my career, when I was working for terrible organizations, failure was something to be shunned and to be punished. But through that, I learned a pretty valuable lesson from probably one of my worst bosses, was that if I screwed anything up, she had better hear about it from me rather than her boss. And that kind of forced me into a environment in my brain in which I was comfortable with failure, not because it was viewed well within the organization, but that I had to. I had to be able to walk into her office and explain, here's what I did, and here's what happened, and here's probably the fallout, so what are we going to do? And I think ultimately that ended up being a good thing, because it allowed me to, in other situations, at organizations that were maybe a little bit more tolerant of failure and a little bit more supportive of their employees, that to be able to have that exact same conversation at a moment's notice is, hey, here's what happened. And I think an example of that working out well, probably the first big time in my career in which a failure left me feeling really good about the world, actually, at the end of it, was a time that I was working at a company called Sport Engine here in town that hopefully some of you have heard of before. It was the morning of it was about 2 hours before the puck dropped on the championship match of the boys' state hockey tournament, which was a big deal for us because it was the biggest traffic day of the year for us at the time, with our partnership with the Star Tribune for the Minnesota Hockey Hub. And there was like some national brand was testing an ad on our platform on the Hockey Hub, that the success of which was going to determine if they were going to give us tremendous sums of money going forward. I had nothing to do with any of that, but what I did have to do with is I was spinning up a new staging environment because we were testing a complete reorganization of our user management. And I spun up a second staging environment that morning because we were as soon as the tournament was over and things were cooler, we were actually going to hopefully deploy that the next week. So we were in the final stages of testing. We wanted to keep it separate from everything else. We spun up a new environment, and I deployed that branch to that environment, and it went really well. And then I got a page from New Relic that we had about 12% error rate on our production environment. And those of you who are not developers, I assure you that is a very high number. Well, that can't be right. Check New Relic. Yep, that's right. Check one of the pages that it says is erroring. Yes, it's erroring. What is that error? That doesn't make any sense, because it looks as if I had run the migration that changed all of the underlying data for this branch out on production, which makes no sense. I didn't do a staging environment. I checked the deploy record. Everything is as it should be. But the fact remained that I had done that. That had happened. It took me a couple minutes to realize why that had happened, but we were still 2 hours from the puck dropping on the biggest traffic day of the year. And I tapped my boss on the shoulder. He's sitting behind me. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about right now, but I have something very important to tell you now. This is what has happened. He agreed that that was very important, and I was right to interrupt his conversation. And we had a choice to make. We could either restore from the last backup that we made about 6 hours prior, lose all of the data that had been changed during that intervening time, and hopefully that process would be complete by the time the puck dropped. Or we could decide that the only way out is through, and let's actually deploy the code out to the production environment and do what we need to do. And we ended up making that choice, that that's what we would do. And he went to talk to his boss, who talked to whoever he needed to talk to, say, hey, everybody, this is what's happening. By now, obviously, customer service had become aware of the problem because people there at the Excel Center had become aware of the problem. Advertiser had become aware of the problem. They were, of course, one of the 12% of pages that didn't load. And so they noticed right away. And what happened is the entire team of developers stopped everything they were doing and began to converge on this problem. Because while the branch was almost complete, there were obviously bugs that needed to be ironed out. And what my day consisted of was perform a deploy, which took about 10 minutes, pull down any changes that anybody else had made during the intervening 10 minutes, do another deploy. More people would make more changes to fix whatever bugs there were, and iterated that throughout the day and kind of continued some of us into the weekend to wrap things up. And I went home that night and told my wife that I'm not sure that I had a job when I'd come back into work on Monday morning. And that wasn't me exaggerating, that was me just kind of being frank with her that I screwed something up really big. But I didn't screw up something really big. The fact is that I'm the one who did that deploy. If somebody else had done the exact same thing I did, the same thing would have happened, because there were about 3 or 4 things that we were doing wrong kind of within our tech stack that allowed that to even happen in the first place. And that was the problem. I mean, yes, I ended up making a mistake because we hadn't set up a DNS entry correctly in the process leading up to that deployment. And that was kind of on the team. Maybe I should have double-checked that. And that's ultimately what led the migration to perform on production instead of this other environment that I'd set up for it. And it was just by happenstance that had never happened before. So over the course of the next week, there were no reprisals to me. Everything, we just kind of kept on going about our business, but we fixed those 3 or 4 things within the code base. Our staging environments no longer use the same top-level domain as our main product. That's one thing. Never do that. Wildcard subdomains can be a bitch. And a couple other changes within our code base just to make sure that was never, ever going to happen again, because thankfully it hadn't until that moment, and it just happened to be a really bad time. But that was, to finally answer your question about epiphanies, that was like the first experience in my professional career where I learned the value of a good team and of an organization that supports you, and of treating failure as systemic rather than, oh, burn him at the stake, and then it'll never happen again until the next time it happens. And that was the first of probably many such examples at that organization and my current job now, in which a healthy way of looking at failure is not to find the one thing that went wrong, but to find all of the things in your system that helped, that made that possible. Because what I did was deployed branch to a new environment. That was a reasonable thing to do, but it didn't work. But I thought it was a reasonable thing to do. Why did I think it was reasonable? Rather than, why are you so dumb? So, I don't know that I answered your question, but I think I answered about 3 or 4 other questions throughout the course of that. Yes, in the black.
So once you get to the point where you're personally okay and you can accept that failure is going to happen, it's a thing that's going to be in my life, other than sessions like this,
Mm-hmm.
how do you socialize an idea like that? Because I feel like I've been kind of struggling with that, and
Mm-hmm.
I've worked at companies in the past where it's like, okay, well, this happened, let's assess why it happened,
Mm-hmm.
and the company, someone in the company is like, oh, you're so dumb, and I'm like, no, dude, you're harshing my home.
Mm-hmm.
It just got to this point where I'm going to accept failure, and you're not okay with it.
You're making this hard on me.
Yeah, exactly. How do you socialize that message in a way that doesn't sound self-serving?
I would encourage everybody in this room, if they haven't already, to actually go out to the Etsy blog. It's called Code is Craft. Find what they talk about, just culture and blameless postmortems, and just kind of internalize all of that yourself. Because getting to a point where you accept this is certainly hard enough as it is, as you mentioned, to not punish myself for being dumb. The other thing to kind of help socialize this is exactly what I'm doing actually right here, trying to spread the gospel as far and wide as I can, just to anybody who might already need, who might need little bit of a nudge in the right direction on that front, because we're all kind of raised, you know, in American culture is about exceptionalism and individualism and so on. And what that can mean is that you often, if something screws up, you try to find the blame in yourself, and that's not always true. But the tricky part about socializing that around an organization is that is very difficult, because a blameless postmortem is fine, but if you're the only one that's acting blamelessly, if your boss is not, if your colleagues are not, that doesn't work. Like, you can be in there like, oh yes, this is what happened, and let's talk about this dispassionately and find the systemic failures. But that's a really easy way for it to become all of a sudden be aimed at you, I suppose, if somebody else is craven enough to try to exploit that. But the fact is, even if your entire team, if all of your colleagues are on board with blameless postmortems, if with the idea of systemic failure, if your boss isn't, or if his boss isn't, then that's all for naught. Because if they're looking for somebody to blame, they're going to find somebody to blame, and whoever that is, it's not going to be deserved. So long story short, I think it's an important conversation to be having within your teams, but if you're not getting buy-in from all levels, I think you need to find a team in which that will offer that kind of buy-in. And if that means leaving your organization, I think that that's a healthy thing to do, because it's an organization that needs to suffer. That came off a lot harsher than I actually intended it to. I think I saw some other hands earlier. Does anybody have any stories of embracing your fear, of embracing your failure, beyond the story that I just told? Putting you all on the spot? Yes, sir, in the middle.
It's a story, but not really. It's more that it's become, one time, a close friend of mine, we were coding, there was some data that got all screwed up, so we were trying to fix it, we ran it, and sort of some checks out, and we realized it was crap. Call our boss, 2 a.m., blah, 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 right? But it's become like in both of our careers, in our social circle, it's become a little bit, it's like a achievement or something. We failed so miserably that it was awesome.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it.
And it is, in some ways, that feels like the opposite of what you're saying. In some ways, it's like, why are we celebrating how stupid, right?
Yeah.
But I guess it worked out okay, and maybe that's sort of what this, we figured it out.
Exactly. You went through that and you survived. And wow, can you believe the series of steps that we took there? We're not going to do that again. My first professional programming job was at a local search engine, and the whole system was terrible on a variety of fronts. But there was one area in which it was possible to accidentally delete some hand-entered data, because it was hand-entered into a form that looks like it's for scraping data. And eventually, you will make that mistake. And it just happened. It was something that everybody did, and it would happen, and you'd have to report it to the person who was responsible for putting that data back in there. And it was just something we told ourselves, is that you're not really part of the Planet Discover team until you have irrevocably deleted some customer data. And then now you are. Welcome to the team. Probably, like you said, not the healthiest way to look at it, but I mean, it's one way to kind of answer your question earlier. Socializing that viewpoint is just pat on the back. There you go, kid. And then move on, because shaking your finger at somebody doesn't fix anything. I mean, ultimately, we should have made the system more resilient, more redundant, and the fact that we didn't is one of many reasons why I'm not at that company anymore. But I think that's a healthy way of looking at it. If you can laugh about it, then you're at least in a good position about it, and hopefully you can get to a position where everybody else can laugh about it too, I think.
And I think that this is like, it's like a really good entry point into being able to talk about when I'm scared or when I've screwed up,
Mm-hmm.
is to be able to start with joking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Is to be able to say to the people that I'm working with that matter to me, okay, I really screwed this up. You're all going to start reporting, so here's what just happened, and here's how I feel about it, and then we're going to figure out what to do next. That's an awful lot of soul bearing right there.
Yep.
So if I could start off with a joke about what I just exploded or set on fire, it at least can get the conversation started that way.
Exactly. I mean, humor is a really good way to get through a lot of difficult things, not just in your professional life. I mean, but if you can laugh about it, if you can hopefully get other people to laugh about it too, I think that's better for everybody involved. I mean, it's all part of continuing to perpetuate this idea that failure is not something to be hidden from or to be embarrassed of. Which isn't to say that every mistake you make is something that is ultimately got a fun story and a silver lining at the end of it. But I think more mistakes than we kind of allow ourselves for are mistakes that are really just whatever. I think. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that I think that's sort of one way to help socialize this message, right? So you don't need to socialize it just when you're going to make a mistake, right? Like people on our teams make mistakes all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and we can control to some degree, at least try to, how we react to those problems, right? And so you react gracefully when one of your colleagues fails. It's going to be a lot easier for them to react gracefully when you fail.
I think that's a really good point. To be a little bit less selfish about it, about how this affects you, but a little bit more selfless about it, about directing that at other people, directing that acceptance and that of other people's failures. I guess is just important. And it's really easy for me to stand up here and say that when I screw up, you guys should all be very cool about it. It is harder when your colleague screws up and it really impacts you. That's a harder thing to do, and we're all of us here hypocrites. But that's one thing probably to be mindful of, is to maybe don't be a hypocrite about that, because that just helps perpetuate it exactly as you said. I think that was really good. I'm going to get to you in just a second because I already talked to you, but this woman in the back in the red, you raise your hand.
I attended a presentation to share on slide share a standard of pixel perfection, but it's all about a lot of us in this industry are perfectionists.
Yep.
And so not only do we fear failure, we almost fear success as much because we're always waiting for that other shoe to drop. Someone to look a little too closely at our success, find where we messed up,
Mhm.
and so we don't celebrate the successes and we never highlight the failures because that's a reflection on us. And so it's you have to celebrate the success right along with recognizing and learning from the failure. They kind of have to come up together.
I think that's a good point.
So that it feels both ends of the spectrum, because otherwise you're not helping your team. Anyways, and the other part about this is perfectionism and this fear of failure and success. You have to think about how it affects your entire team. So you see a little bit of failure, you're trying to avoid it, you're trying to prepare for it, you're worrying about it, your entire team gets agitated, and they forget that we're successful, we're winning
Mhm.
9 times out of 10.
Yep.
You come back into work, you're winning.
Nine times out of 10 is a really good success rate, and that's something to be celebrated and acknowledged. I think you're absolutely right. I think it makes a lot of sense. Yes, in the black.
Yeah, so the previous question I asked about how do you socialize this was in part because I had a job where it was absolutely a culture of fear. It was a culture of blame. And ironically, it was a company that I never got fired from, so I don't really understand where the blame came from. Nobody ever lost their job for screwing.
Well, the blame was a coping mechanism. The blame was not for solving any problem.
Yeah, it was interesting. So when I left that company finally, I'm a UX designer, so I get to be out front and I'm at the beginning of the project and I'm at the start of the process and I get to talk a lot about what the process is. So
Mhm.
kind of one of my tactics to address this is to say the word fail as many times as I can. And the idea is that if we fail in UX in the front, we did it right because it cost us $500 versus $500,000.
Mhm.
And you're supposed to fail because you have to accept that most of your assumptions are going to be incorrect. That's why I test them. So this is something that I will say constantly, and you can kind of gauge what sort of audience you're walking into by the look of panic that crosses people's face when you say failure is okay.
Mhm. Exactly. No, I think that's good, especially in testing your clients a little bit. There is fail is probably a very scary word for them to hear when you're talking about spending their money. Probably. I think that's a really good. And that helps then perpetuate that forward as well. As they're going to hopefully internalize that a little bit. That recognizing that failure is part of the process. And then maybe spread that to their vendors and their colleagues and their family and their friends, and we'll just have a movement across the United States about embracing our failure. And it all started from here today with all of you in this room, and all of the people who've done important work before me and whatever, I don't care. Exactly, write down that success. I changed the world. That's all I did. How many people in this room are software developers? Okay, I assumed a lot of hands because I saw hands when that was asked earlier to the whole audience. One thing that's very hard to do, especially very early in software development, is accept criticism in pull requests. Everybody who has gotten criticism in a pull request about the code that you wrote and felt immediately defensive and angry about that criticism, can you raise your hand for me, please? Exactly. I was expecting to see a lot of hands. That's another thing I think about, kind of talking about the failure she was talking about the inexpensive upfront failures that you can experience is writing code. I spend an hour, 2 hours a day writing this code. I send it off to my team. It comes back to me, and they're like, well, it's not good enough. They've hopefully said it better than that. But the fact remains is that it's not good enough for a variety of reasons. But it's cheaper for them to tell you that now and for you to accept that and internalize that and improve yourself and improve the communication among your team and to improve the code. It's cheaper to do that then than a year from now when it causes some kind of catastrophic bug. So, yes, ma'am.
I was just going to throw in a quick story about how I'm at my first development position. I've been there 6 months. And one of the things that had the biggest impact on me was that the Friday where I released my first major project, of course, again, Friday, we're just going to do this. But a few hours before the end of the day, there was a big mistake that I made in it, and it assigned 400 accounts, which at the time I thought was a big deal, to the wrong person. And I always felt like real developers never make mistakes. Real developers never had these bugs.
We're smarter than that, right?
Because I was new, I failed, and that day just so happened to coincide with the going away party for one of the developers in our engineering department, to which I was invited. And it made a huge difference to me being able to sit down that evening over drinks with a bunch of other developers who told me all the times they had failed. All the bugs that they had written into code that blew up things, that deleted things, that caused all these problems. So with that, I just say that I think it is really important to be able to share that, especially with people who are newer to the field, who think that everything's supposed to be perfect.
Because all you see are people writing blog posts about a cool thing that they launched or a cool gem that they wrote. They didn't talk about the year they spent butting their head against the problem and arriving at no solution. And that's ultimately a disservice to you and to anybody else who's coming into the field who have get these ideas about everything. Everyone else is so smart. I think that's a really great story, and I think that's kind of a lesson for those of us who are a little bit more senior. And all of a sudden, I pointed at myself talking about more senior, and I felt very self-conscious about putting on airs. All of you who are more senior, to share those stories with your newer colleagues, with the junior developers on your team, because that's something I'm honestly never thought about sharing my failures with other people as not just to make me feel better about my failures, but to make them feel better about their own failures. Because the story I told was just the biggest story. There are plenty others. But yeah, I think that's really important. That's another part of socializing, the culture of accepting that failure happens, and it's really about what you do next. It's not about what led to the failure, because it happened. That you can't undo that. But learning from that and accepting the faults within yourself. That's to get all Buddhist about it. Yeah. Anybody else have anything more to share? Yes.
Monday morning, a while back, I came in and my text editor was still open from the week before, and I started editing my document. Click save, and it overwrote all the work that someone else had done over the weekend. Told my boss right away, and he laughed, and said, yeah, that happens, and help me fix it. And the next day, we're using version control.
That's the best part about that story. Because what was wrong with the system? What was wrong with the system is not that you saved over somebody's change. What was wrong with the system is that you had no way to undo that, or no reasonable way to undo that. Yeah, we all remember. Hopefully, we all remember the last time we didn't use version control. Hopefully, that's something that's seared into all of our brains, because it's catastrophic when it happens, or it can be. That's a really good story. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Yes, sir.
I'm actually trying to get into web development. Teaching myself slowly but surely when I'm not doing my other job. And I had an interview about 2 months ago. And I went into the interview. I had done a code test for them and turned it in, and it looked great. At least I said it looked great. And I had, it was the weirdest interview. I had like a series of people come and talk to me. Their developer team, they all came in individually.
That's good.
One of them came in and I was speaking to him, and he asked me to write a JavaScript code for it. And I had been doing everything in JavaScript, and I felt like going in, I was great at JavaScript. I turned around to the whiteboard, and I looked at the whiteboard, and I was just frozen. I couldn't think of what to do. I couldn't think of where to start. Do I start from the very before? What do you? I had no idea.
Mhm.
I looked down, and it just felt like the humiliation,
Mhm.
just like pounding at me, and I just turned around that I can't do it. And it was the ultimate, like, like deflating feeling.
Mhm.
And I felt like shit for the rest of the time. I still had to go through the rest of the interview. And talk to like all these different people. And, but I don't know. I felt like I achieved something just from going.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Can I just interrupt you real quick? Can we have a show of hands if anybody else has had that exact same experience in a job interview? More than once? All right. So I want you to continue, but I want you to understand that what you experienced was incredibly common, and yes, it's humiliating. But oh, sorry. Well, McDonald's that's an important part of this story. Yeah, that happens. Those kinds of job interviews, I'm of the opinion, are not helpful. Didn't help you that day for me to say that right now, but we've all been there. That's fantastic. Well, I think I've probably taken up enough of your time. Thank you all for being here, for participating, for sharing your stories and asking your questions, and go on and spread the gospel of embracing your fear and embracing your failure. Thanks a lot, guys.